Stories of struggle, survival, and self-respect in 20th century St. Louis. That story is next on City Corner. I'm Steve Potter, and welcome to City Corner. That's the way it was. Stories of struggle, survival, and self-respect in 20th century St. Louis. That's the name of a new book. The author is Sister Prince, and she joins us now.
Black St. Louis.
In Black St. Louis. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that's an important aspect of the book.
Right.
It's all about looking back and sort of examining from first-person accounts stories of segregation. Mm-hmm. So how did this book come about for you, Sister?
Well, it came about, I was a volunteer at the Missouri Historical Society, and I was they were doing exhibitions every year of a different decade in the Black community. Mm-hmm. And all of the people that are interviewed were born in the first part of the 20th century. So I was given the wonderful task of interviewing Marion Oldham, who was a civil rights activist and civic leader. And she, it was 1987, and she remarked in the last part of it, she told how it was to live in St. Louis in the 1940s, how she grew up and what it was like downtown. And if I may, I could read that to you, what she said.
Sure.
Okay. I think there was not a time that I did not go downtown to, let's say, buy a pair of shoes or dress or something that I did not want to go places and do things that were forbidden to me. When you pass an eating counter, naturally you want to eat, particularly children. So I think from a tiny child on, your parents try to shield you from the lunch counters because they know and you know. But there is a hurt, and there is a feeling of being less than human. And the next paragraph, which is short, is what made me do all of this. I think it was marvelous the way our parents went ahead with life and made something out of themselves and their children and had a reasonably healthy existence despite the real outside world. I left Marion's home, walked down the steps, got in my car, and I thought, how did those parents do that? How actually, it just was like that for me. And I wanted to know that. I think I need some water. And so I imagined that they would take their children downtown for shopping, and then the child was hungry, it was lunchtime, and there was no place for them to eat. Mm-hmm. And I could just see the parent leaning down to talk to the child, and I wondered what the heck would he be saying? How could he explain all of this? So I began and putting something together. And
you just started interviewing people. I think you interviewed 24 people altogether,
24 people, but it took me a while. I didn't do this until 5 years later because I was busy with something else, but it came up so often. And I don't know if anybody remembers Greg Freeman.
Sure, I knew Greg.
Okay. Well, I called him up, didn't know him. But
Greg was a newspaper guy, also on the radio.
Yes.
Right.
And I asked him what he thought about this idea I had of interviewing people. I wanted to know how they learned who they were. I wanted to know how they learned that there were people whose skin was a different color than theirs and that it made a difference.
You know what I found interesting in the portions of the book that I was able to read, the profiles, I was surprised how many young black kids seemed not to realize there was segregation. You just referred to maybe their parents sort of protecting them against it, but they really weren't aware of it until they got a little bit older. I was surprised by that.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that because it's very important. I think what fascinated me was the different ways that everybody learned who they were and all these things I'm saying. And what happened with me was, I would hope that this probably is well, I would hope it wouldn't happen to too many people who are trying to put something together. But I came in with my own thoughts, okay? And that was that they would be sitting in the kitchen at the dinner table, and somebody would say, oh, this happened to me today, and then they would all discuss it. So the first person I interviewed was Demosthenes DuBose. And I said to him, this is new to me, so I want you to critique me after my first interview. We'll have more, but after the first one, tell me what you think that I'm doing. And so I did ask him, and he said, well, you ask a lot of questions about how people, parents and children, talk to each other, but that didn't happen in my house. And I thought, oh, I spent months putting this together. So then we talked a little bit, and he said, but I think you should go on and interview other people the same way, you know. Well, I'm driving home on Skinker, and I'm thinking, he's just knocked my project off it, you know. And then I began to realize I didn't know what they were doing. I only imagined I knew. And so then I thought to myself, because I was so upset, now I really have a project.
Let's jump right into it. That's the way it was as the book. And I've just chosen from random some of the people you profiled in the book. And let's just talk a little bit about them. I want to talk first about a guy by the name of Richard A. Martin. And we have a picture of him in his home. And he's doing a little dance there in front of an aunt of his who I think just about everybody would recognize.
Yeah.
Josephine Baker.
Josephine Baker, right. Yeah, that was his father's sister.
And he'd been here for generations. I think it was 8th generation or something.
Yes, his family was 8th generation, right.
And we were talking about kids being aware of segregation, and he makes the point in your book of saying that he wasn't aware of segregation. I think it was until he went into the Army.
Right.
And there's a picture of him as a young kid when he had performed at the Muni.
Oh, yeah, it's a wonderful picture, isn't it? He says, I want to read you this because it's almost hard to believe. I've always lived in a segregated area, but I always knew there were people whose skin was a different color than mine because my grandmother always told me of the different colors of people. It didn't mean anything. It's just what my grandfather said, that we were colored because we were all just like flowers. So I look at people of different colors as part of the flowers. I really mean that. I didn't see any weaknesses or strong points or any special gifts, you know. They were just colors. I was not aware of segregation. I'm right here in St. Louis, and I was not taught that. I was aware that when you went downtown, that they could go places, but that it was okay with them. They knew they had their things and
Just sort of accepted the way things were.
Yeah, he did. But he really, he didn't feel, he had their own movies and their own places to go, and so it didn't bother him until he came in, you know, was in the Army. But that's very different from the rest of them.
Right. Let's skip ahead to Pearl Shank, and we have a picture of her. I think it's her class picture from 1944. And she lived in what they call the Mill Creek area, which I've heard of them. Mm-hmm. And she talks about first becoming aware of racism, I think, during a trip to Virginia?
Yes, yes.
What happened?
Well, with her mother and her brother, because they passed the Mason-Dixon line, and they had to sit in the back of the bus, and that was very difficult. And they, as far as drinking fountains and going to the bathroom and things like that, that was separated. And it was very upsetting for her. It made her mad, and she knocked her hands on the table when she was talking, I remember.
She also has, there's an interesting concept she talks about black people passing for white.
Yes.
Quote unquote passing.
Yes.
And she and some friends are, I think, walking down Grand, and
yes.
I think see a teacher of hers at the Fox.
Right. And yes, they were. She was standing in line, and they passed her. They saw her, and then they passed her, and then they went back, took another look, because they weren't quite sure, and they kept saying, "Is that her? Is that? Yes, it is, it is." And she explained that it was hard for people it wasn't because they didn't want to be white because they thought that was better. It was just easier. You could get jobs, you could have a life, and so it was hard for them. I think what I want to talk about for a second is the confusion. Maybe they'll say no, but truly, if you think about it, it was hard for parents. These parents and children were very good to each other. The children did not want to embarrass the parents. We can't go there. The parents didn't want to talk, they didn't talk hatefully about whites. It was just their life, and they tried to make the best of it. And I think they did from the people that I spoke with. It wasn't a time when they rose up. It was a time when they tried to figure out, how do we do this? How do we make good lives? And they did make good lives, and they were good to each other. And I think that is just an important thing. But in the meantime, the parents didn't understand, the children didn't understand, and they just tried to work together, that's all.
Maybe it was a more innocent time in some ways, I guess.
Well, I think it was, and I think that, I think they told me what they wanted me to hear. I don't push when I interview. I don't go into areas that I'm going to make them uncomfortable. I wanted, when I left, for them to feel good about what they did. They always came on time. They always tried their very best, and I think together we knew what we were doing,
That's the way it was. We're going to take a little break and come back and talk more about the book and a look back on segregated St. Louis and the stories, firsthand stories people had to tell about that. We'll be back with more City Corner right after this.
Kids will spend 15 minutes watching online videos like this one.
Brushing for 2 minutes now can save your child from severe tooth pain later. 2 minutes twice a day. They have the time.
Experience St. Louis!
So, same time next week?
Well, of course. Put away a few bucks, feel like $1 million. For free tips to help you save, go to Feed the Pig.
The odds of this daughter of a clergyman spending 11 weeks at #1 on the U.S. singles charts? 1 in 19 million. The odds of going on to win 6 Grammy Awards? 1 in 1.4 million. The odds of having a child diagnosed with autism? 1 in 110. I'm Toni Braxton, and I encourage you to learn the signs of autism at autismspeaks.org.
I'm Steve Potter, and welcome back to City's Corner. We're talking to Sister Prince today about her new book, That's the Way It Was, Stories of Struggle, Survival, and Self-Respect in 20th Century Black St. Louis. And what you did was you interviewed a number of people over the years to hear their personal stories of what segregated St. Louis was like. Before we go any further, I want to ask you about your name, Vida Sister Prince.
Okay.
Now, we call you sister, but you're not a nun.
No.
So,
My brother did that to me. I think when I was born, he was 3 years older, and they just said, "This is your baby sister." And so my mother's name was Vida, and they named me Vida, so I think they just picked up the sister, and that's where it came. But
so sister stuck.
Sister stuck, and it stuck in a way that whoever I interview, they just say Sister Prince in one word.
Sister Prince.
Sister Prince.
Okay, I'll get that.
Okay.
Before we go any further, we're going to talk about some of the individuals and tell their stories. You wanted to make a point about how for the people we're talking about, many of them growing up in 30s, 40s, 50s, St. Louis, how the laws of the day, the segregation, the laws of the day really influenced them on a daily basis.
Yeah, it was really earlier in a way. The first person I interviewed was born in 1902, Mr. Lewis. Yes, I want to read this because the laws, the St. Louis, the customs and the laws, written and unwritten, governed every aspect of their lives, including where they were born, where they were allowed to live, where their education, their occupation, where they worshiped, where they spent their leisure time, and where they were buried. And that's a whole lot of life to contend with. So this is really what it's about. How did they live in this world?
Yeah, I'd like how you put it too, the laws written and unwritten. Sometimes it's the unwritten laws that can have just as much an effect.
It's the meanness of it all, just the tiny meanness of it all, for no reason except.
Let's talk about Gabrielle Wilson, and we have a picture of her, I think, as a child with some of her siblings. And she's an interesting story because her grandfather was a doctor, and then her grandmother was a character too.
They were both amazing people for her. They were very close, and they were very light-skinned. Okay, the grandfather was a doctor in St. Charles, and they thought he was white, and he didn't say he wasn't or wasn't, you know. But they loved him. They went to him, and the children would go out there, and they would be introduced as his children, you know, grandchildren. And so it was, Gabrielle didn't feel anything about that. I mean, everything was fine. Her grandmother took her to the Fox Theater, took her in. She was told to stay in the car. They went and got tickets, and then they'd go in. And she wondered about that because people stared at her and looked at her, and she didn't know why, you know. But she was like, and her grandmother would take her down to Stixbury and Fuller, and she would take her in, and when they couldn't sit at the, where you had the food at the counter, she and her grandmother sat at the counter. And Gabrielle in here says, my grandmother had a presence, you know. I mean, she did. And so it was confusing.
Because when she talked to her, like friends of hers, and she said, well, we went to see a show at the Fox, and her friends would say, no, you did not.
That's right. You picked up right what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they said, well, you couldn't do that. You couldn't have done it. But she said, but I did, you know. So the whole thing for these children was trying to figure all of this out. I think they told me that they didn't think about it much.
Let's move ahead to George Eliot Jr. He was a teacher for a number of years and involved in the YMCA.
Oh yes, he started being a child at the camp that he went to, what their camp was, and when he was a little boy, and he grew up in that camp. Those people helped him. As he said, learn to be a man, learn to make your bed, and learn to set a table, all the kinds of things. And he had good parents too, but he became. He tells this wonderful story when he was a counselor at camp, and the children would come in, and he said that he wanted them to have a name. It was something where they would grab them. So he would say to them at the first campfire, my name is, I'm Mr. Fox. So they, he said years later, he'd go in a place with, you know, and he'd see one of the men that were boys, and they'd say, "Hi, Mr. Fox. You know, how's Mrs. Fox?" But he grew up in that, and he became a teacher, but he also was always with the Pine Street Y, and then he became involved when they moved it out to the further west.
Someone else you profile in your book is Salma. Am I pronouncing that right?
Salima.
Salima Jones.
Salima Jones.
We've got a picture, I think, of her with her dad. And she said that her dad was one of the few black people that had a camera at that time.
I think so. I think so. They were very, they were very responsible. He took them to the library downtown, got books. They did that. This picture was taken in front of a pickle factory. And the reason the picture was important is because they did not hire anybody in that area, no African Americans.
We have a picture of her as an adult, as a grown woman, but it sort of made me sad reading some of the things she had to say, because unlike some of the people we've talked about, she didn't sound very optimistic about the state of racism.
No.
In fact, some of her last words in the book were that it's always going to be here.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I think that many of them were so ill-treated by trying to find jobs, trying to get ahead, and many of them, like everybody who had to work hard though to get an education, and they'd have to stop and then go back. But they pursued it. They really did. They were determined, and they raised good children who went to college.
We have a picture next of Melvin Hamilton, and this is the first graduating class of Vashon High School.
Right.
Who was he?
Oh, he was a young man who wanted to be a teacher. He really did, and he spent most of his early life trying to do that. It was not an easy thing for him, because they would tell him when he would go to find out what he needed to do, they would not tell him everything he needed to do. They fed it to him in pieces, so each time he came back, he thought he had it this time, and they'd say, well, you have to get this, and you have to get that. So it was very difficult.
And he had an interesting story about meeting Sophie Tucker.
Oh, yes, yeah, right. They kept in touch with each other. He was down at the, it slips my mind right now, but when she was, I
think she played the keel, maybe.
Whatever it was, he would go in and do things for her, and when she left, she gave him a really large tip.
$5.
Yes, and
But that was a lot at the time.
Sure it was, and but because she knew he wanted to be better and do better.
And he was kind of known for his discipline in the classroom.
Yes.
And wasn't there a thing like that he would tell his students at Vashon, or I guess he taught at a couple of high schools, didn't he? That the President of the United States should be able to walk in that classroom at any time. And
that's right. And it was so important to him. And they would do all kinds of things that were for other people. You know, if it was Christmas, they would make things, and there's class. But then if you remember the part where they were having people come, the white people who were responsible for the schools and all that, they were coming to see the classes, and they were walking up the steps, and he heard one of those men say to the other, "See that boy?" Talking about him. I got him out of this, I got him out of that, I did that. And he was so angry because his students were there, he was all prepared, they were going to take their coats and take them and, you know, do all the right things. And then he came along and had them hear that. I took this boy out, and it was not, he said he was this far from, he could have kissed him, he said, but he didn't. He didn't say what he wanted to say.
Let's take a look at one more. This is Stella, is it Bowie?
Bowie.
Stella Bowie, and what a cute little girl, and I understand, and you can tell by looking at her, she wanted to be Shirley Temple.
Absolutely. And I have to tell you very quickly, at the launching of the book, I see this elderly black woman, and she's staring at me, and I think to myself, oh, she's going to ask me a question I don't know the answer to. And when I did call on her, she said, I'm Shirley Temple. So.
And she has some interesting things to say in the book, too. And that's what makes That's the Way It Was such an interesting book, because everybody sort of tells their stories in their own way. She talks about how there are classes in every race. You know,
Oh, yes.
you have your high-class white people, your high-class black people, and
Stella was
so
somebody.
there's a hierarchy.
Yes, but Stella wanted always to be better, and she knew when things, she'll tell you in the book, she knew when you come close to class or that you should learn from them. She started as a elevator, not an elevator operator, but an escalator girl in high school at Sticksbury.
I think we have a picture of that, John.
Yes, and these were wonderful. Then she went to be an elevator operator, which was a very, very high status. It was a clean job, as they said. They crocheted handkerchiefs for their, pockets, and they were quite lovely women.
Before we run out of time, though, sister, tell me what you brought here in front of us.
Oh.
You have some things from some memorial services.
I do. I have two. And this one was Pearl Shanks. And when she died, they got it wrong, but I want to read it anyway. Pearl was very proud of her contribution to the oral history, Raising the Memories in St. Louis, sponsored by the Missouri Historical Society. Excerpts appeared in their spring published and blah, 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 blah. But that's the way it was. And that was, they were so proud of it.
I have to stop you there, unfortunately,
Okay.
out of time, but I want to let people know that your book's out in bookstores, I think now available at the county and city libraries?
Yes.
Right. That's The Way It Was. It's a fascinating book, first-hand account of people that lived through segregation in St. Louis in decades past. Sister Prince, thanks
Lived
so
well.
much. Thanks so much. It was great to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm Steve Potter. That's all the time we have on City Corner. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.